Great, thank you, Maria, and it's great to have an opportunity to chat with you. As Maria said, I'm the Vice President of the Denver Area Access Users Group. I live just south of Denver in Larkspur, Colorado, altitude just about 7,000 feet, and been out here for about 5 years with my wife and kids, and I'm an independent consultant. I left industry about 7 years ago, I think, and sort of struck out on my own, and have a variety of clients ranging from online internet merchants to large computer hardware vendors to government entities. Much of my work is in .Net, and much of my work has been in taking Access databases and migrating those to SQL Server, and then exposing part of that functionality to the web, both traditional desktop browser and mobile. And so what I'd like to do is to share some lessons from that, and also do a quick high-level walkthrough of what's involved. I don't plan on drilling down deeply into any of the technical stuff. I will provide some links and be open to questions, but this will be more kind of high level. This is what's possible. This is an idea of the amount of effort and cost that's associated with this. But any low-level technical questions, I'll just wait until the end and point you to some additional resources. But what we're going to do is come away from this, hopefully in less than half an hour, with a full-blown Access database that was an AACDB running locally and has become an Access client front end with a SQL Server backend and a full-blown ASP.NET website running against that SQL Server, so that I will be able to view and edit the database both from the Access client as well as from the website. Okay, let's get going. Let me quickly talk about prerequisites. So what we're going to basically do, and I'm sure that many people are quite familiar with this, but we're basically going to take an AACDB file, which I have right here, Northwind Customers AACDB, and we are going to migrate that to SQL Server locally here on my machine. And then we're going to quickly wire up a website, a full CRUD website against that database, also locally on my machine. If we have time and there's interest, I can show how to deploy it up to Azure so that then it's publicly available. But we're going to be working locally for two reasons. One is speed of development. If I'm talking to a local SQL Server and a local web server, then I don't have any online latency during development. And the second reason is that that way I can work in isolation and only deploy publicly when that's ready to go. Okay, so what do I need in order to take this standalone AACDB application and turn it into a full-blown SQL Server backend with an ASP.NET MVC website? As I said, here's the database right here, single AACDB. For this example, it's just one table and one form, and it's a customer's form taken from the old Northwind Access database that's been around probably since Access 2 or maybe shortly thereafter. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll through. You see we have Company A, Company B, Company C, Company D, and if we look at our table, it's a relatively simple schema. We've got the company name, last name, first name, job title, business phone address, city, state, zip, and country, and the auto ID. So that's our database. What's involved with getting it up to the cloud? There are a few prerequisites that we're going to need. One is, first of all, we need the Access Database Engine redistributable. This is not the runtime. This is the redistributable. And the reason that we need that is that the tool that we use to upsize is SQL Server Migration Assistant 7 for Access. This is the tool that replaced, I don't know if it was 2010 or 2013, I don't remember, but this replaced the old Upsize Wizard. One of the nice things about it is that it's standalone, so it can be updated separate from Access. And in fact, they just recently released 7.0 in conjunction with SQL Server 2016. There are also migration assistants for a number of different providers, Oracle and others. But we're using SQL Server Migration Assistant 7 for Access, which is the latest. And again, this requires, or at least 6.0 did, I haven't checked on 7, require the database engine redistributable, even if you have a version of Access running on your computer. So that's what's gonna take us up into a SQL database. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna run SSMA, SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. I'm gonna pop that guy open. And you'll see that it's at SQL Server 2016. I don't know if you saw it on the splash screen. But this latest version supports 16, as well as, I think, other previous versions going back to 2005. So we'll go ahead and hit Next. And you can see here in the drop-down, SQL Server 05, 08, 12, 14, 16, and it even supports SQL Azure. So if I wanted to upsize directly into an Azure SQL database, I could do so as well. But again, we're going to work locally. Hit Next, and now I'm going to add a database, and I'm going to go into my presentations, and here is my Northwind Customers AACDB. Go ahead and open that, click Next, and it's going to load that database with all the tables. And you can see we've got one table. It has the option to do to queries. If I have queries, it'll pop those up into SQL, and we'll go ahead and hit Next. And now it's going to tell me what is my target. So we're going to hit the local database, default port, and NWO, Northwind Orders Customers. Windows Authentication, Next. It will create the database for us. Let me go over here to SQL Server Migration Assistant. I will refresh this, and you'll see here in my local databases, I don't have that. NWO Customers is not here. Let's go back over here, click Yes, and we're going to migrate. Now here I have the option, I'm not going to do this, but it'll actually auto-relink your Access database to the SQL backend. Obviously, if you do this, you're going to want to migrate a copy of your database rather than the original, because it will change all of your connections from your local AACDB to the SQL backend. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do it manually, but you do have the option to auto-link within your Access database that you're migrating. And now it's going to run the actual migration, runs a lot of SQL scripts. You see I have some warnings. Let me go ahead and put this window down. Warnings and informational messages. Unless you have errors, you don't need to worry about this. The warnings tend to be things like, oh, your field name has a space, or, that sort of thing. They traditionally don't keep your migration from working. So you can see here it's migrating indices. So I've got all the indices that were in my database are getting migrated. Click OK, and now it's migrating the objects, and it's done that fast. So one table successfully migrated down here at the bottom, 0 tables partially migrated, 0 tables failed to migrate. So I'll go ahead and close this, and I'm done with the wizard for now, so I'll go ahead and close him. Don't want to save that. So if we go back now to SQL Server Management Studio, let me go ahead and refresh this. And you'll see that now in the database list I have NWO customers. I'll expand him, go to my tables. You can see there's my customers table, DBO customers. And if I go down here, they're all columns. And if I right click here and go select top 1,000 rows, you'll see here that I have ID 1, company A, BEDX, Anna, owner. If I go back to my access form, which I closed, you'll see that it's the same data. So let's go ahead and hook up to that data. So we're going to go external data, ODBC database. We're going to link to the database, to the SQL database. We'll go OK. And I'm going to create a DSN to do that. So I'll go New, User Data Source, and I don't know if anybody else has this in their system, but I have like Portuguese drivers and German drivers. No French. So I'm going to do SQL Server Native Client next. Finish. Okay, I'll call this NWO Customers. Doesn't really matter what it is. I'm going to connect to the local database. I'm going to use the integrated Windows authentication. And I will change the database to Northwind Customers. Next. Finish. Test the connection. Looks good. And go OK. So here's my DSN. I'm going to go OK. And now it's going to ask me what I want to import. It gives me every single possible thing in that database. You can see all the system objects, and the schemas, but here's my little table up here. That's what I want. So click OK. And now you can see I have DBO customers. I can then rewire my form to use that, or I can just set up a new form to hit that. And just for the sake of time, just to show you, it works just like the local database. Get rid of timestamp and finish. So here's my DBO customers. Okay, so close. All right, so if we go up here, just so we have ID 3, we have Company C, Thomas Axon. Let's go over here to our SQL Server query. And you can see here that we have ID 3, Company C, Axon, Thomas. So let's just, for grins, let's just change this to Tom. Okay, so now we have Tom here in the Access client hitting the DBO customers table, the SQL table. Let's go back here to our SQL Server, and we'll just refresh this query here. And you can see here now we have Tom as a name. So now we are talking with our Access client to our SQL Server backend. So it's that straightforward. Let me, before I pause for questions, let me say about the SQL Server instance that I have running locally. SQL Server development, which I think is normally $60, which is a worthy investment for anybody doing Access development, is available for free if you sign up at my.visualstudio.com. So this is the third sort of tool that we have in our toolbox here. We have the redistributable, which powers the migration assistant, and now the SQL, the instance of SQL Server. So if I come down here, you can see I have SQL Server Developer Edition. So all you do is you go to my.visualstudio.com, sign up with a Microsoft ID or a Live ID or a Microsoft account, Hotmail, Outlook, MSN, and you can get SQL Server for free. Let me quickly say that there are some other things you can get for free, which are really cool. One is $25 in Azure Credit per month per year. So if you want to mess around with having your SQL databases in the cloud, in other words, available to expose to applications from wherever they may be by connecting to an internet database as opposed to a local or a CorpNet database, you can get 25 Azure credits per month for a whole year. And a single instance of a SQL Server database at the smallest tier is $5. So this will give you 5 free SQL Azure databases per year, which is fantastic. The other thing that's really great is this thing called Pluralsight, which is a 3-month subscription. And this is great if you want to expand beyond Access. Let's say that you're going to be doing more SQL Server work. Well, Pluralsight has some fantastic courses on SQL Server. It also has wonderful ASP.NET web courses, and it has more web basic courses like HTML or CSS or JavaScript. It's absolutely wonderful. It really is world-class training. So you get 3 months of that for free. I think it's normally 19 or 29 bucks a month, but you can free and then just do your video binging there as opposed to your large screen TV. But the important thing is the SQL Server Developer Edition. So you download it here and you install it, and then you have a local instance of SQL Server that you can talk to. So you'll notice here that I'm talking to Maracana George, which is my local machine, and that's my user. Okay, so we've taken the Access database and we've migrated into SQL Server. Are there any questions before we move on to the web stuff? Great. Okay, we're going to keep rolling ahead. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No questions from the group, but I have a question, and that's why use SQL Server developer version as opposed to Express? Is there any reason between that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Of course, Express is free, and you can either manually download it or it comes installed with some things like Visual Studio. The reason I like the SQL Server Developer Edition is that it fully maps in its functionality to SQL Server 2016 and to SQL Azure Database. That said, I'm not sure there's much that Express doesn't do that developer can do. So the void may not be that big, and I know that Microsoft has done a lot of work to make their free offerings, their free developer offerings, as feature compatible with their full offerings as possible. So it's certainly not necessary. I like being able to refer to a database just as dot when I connect to an instance. With SQL Express, I think the default /SQL Express v12.0. Addressing it is a little bit more complicated, but the reason you couldn't use Express, I would say that if you do sign up for the free Visual Studio benefits, which you should anyway for the $300 in Azure a year and the Pluralsight training, I would say it's worth if you have the system resources to install SQL Server locally, but it is not required, strictly speaking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are still in here talking to our SQL database. In fact, let me just go ahead and delete the local access stuff. So I'm going to get rid of that, just to make sure that indeed we are still talking to SQL Server. Tom is still Tom. Let's go ahead and change it back to Thomas. And go over here. And now we got Thomas. Okay, so we have our local SQL instance. Now what we're going to do is really step off into somewhat uncharted territory. By the way, I need to mention this as another requirement. If you're not working against a local database, or you have an older version of Express or of SQL installed, you should get the latest SQL Server Management Studio. You can download this also as part of a download of SQL Server Express, but you can see it was just recently updated on September 23rd, so just a month ago. So here's where you would download SQL Server Management Studio if you want to download as a standalone. Let's say you just want to work against a remote SQL database on your network, or you just want to work against SQL Azure and not work against a local database. So you would get this. Okay, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to use Visual Studio, which is the Microsoft developer integrated development environment, to generate a database-driven web app from that SQL Server database that our Access front end talks to. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about freebies. Microsoft offers a version of Visual Studio for free. It used to be called Visual Studio Express. It is now called Visual Studio Community Edition, and it is almost fully has full feature parity with the Professional and the Enterprise editions. So it is much like SQL Server Express. It is a full-blown developer class development environment, and it's fantastic, and it's free. So if I come down here, I'm on visualstudio.com/vs, and I click Download Visual Studio. You can see that I have Professional, whoops, which I didn't mean to click, sorry. I have which I didn't mean to click, Enterprise, I'm trying to highlight it, apologies, and I have Visual Studio Community. So the Community is the free one. Free, fully featured IDE for students, open source, and individual developers. Obviously, if you're working in an enterprise, you would want to have them get you Visual Studio with probably with an MSDN subscription. But as an independent developer, as a student, if you're doing open source, if you're a hobbyist, if you're just trying to learn and extend your Access skills beyond the Access environment, it is fully free. So, in fact, all these things are free. So SQL Server Developer was free, SSMS is free, the Migration Assistant for Access is free, the Database Engine Redistributable is free. If you sign up for the my.visualstudio.com, you get Azure hosting for free, which with Azure you get 10 free websites, web apps. And then if you sign up for this the myvisualstudio.com Developer Essentials program, you also get 5 free databases a month. So far we haven't spent a penny. Okay, so let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to use Visual Studio, and we're going to basically auto-generate a data-driven website from that SQL Server database. So let's go ahead and fire up Visual Studio here, and I'm going to keep this very basic. Visual Studio supports everything from web development to mobile development to large data structure development, SQL Server, C#, Visual Basic, Node.js, JavaScript. It's huge. SharePoint, Office, but we're just going to do a basic web ASP.NET website hitting that local database. One thing that Visual Studio includes is a local web server that runs when you run your site in Visual Studio. So you don't have to do any machine configuration or figure out how to configure IIS or something. The Visual Studio automatically starts up a website whenever you run your starts up a web server whenever you run your application. All right, how do we generate a website from a SQL Server database? File, New, Project. And what this will give us is the classic wizard that is going to allow us to almost without, I think we're going to do this without actually writing any code, which is pretty interesting, generate this website. So here you can give you an idea of some of the complexity of Visual Studio, right? Game development, data factory development, Python, SQL, C++, F#, Visual Basic. We're going to go into C# Web. We could do this in Visual Basic, and I want to take just a second to talk about that. So Visual Basic is an actively supported language by Microsoft. So anything, if you come with a very strong, let's say you have a good VBA background from working in Access, you can use Visual Basic, and you will be able to do everything that you can do in C#. Obviously, it's going to be syntactically different, but you can do everything that you can do in C#. Now, that said, there's a caveat, and that caveat is that the vast majority of .NET development is done in C#. There is some VB done, but the vast majority is .NET development. What does that mean? That means that almost any samples that are out there on the web, any sort of forums like Stack Overflow. Those are all going to be almost exclusively in C#. So if somebody has a question, how do I do this in .NET? 99 times out of 100, maybe not quite that much, 95 times out of 100, the answer is going to be in C#. So if you come into doing .NET development, you have to make a decision: am I going to go with VB or am I going to go with C#? Either way, there's going to be some pain for you. If you go in with VB and you have a VB background, you're going to get up and running more quickly because you're going to be familiar with the language. But whenever you go out and try to get help, look up some code samples or ask a question or do some research on an issue, that answer more than likely is going to be in C#, and you're going to have to figure out, how do I map that into VB? If you decide to start with C#, you're going to have more work to do up front. You have a little bit of a steeper learning curve. But the payoff is, first of all the examples and all the samples are in C#, so you're going to be able to use those and work with those directly without having to map to VB. The second thing is that the vast majority of development in the industry is done in C#. So if you're looking for somebody to help you with a project, let's just say you've done a .NET website for a client, and now you've decided that you need a little bit more. You need a little bit help with some of the more detailed aspects of how the website works. You're going to find vast numbers of C# developers and rather few VB developers. So there is that to consider. If you don't have a VBA background, then I would recommend just going to C#. If you do have a VBA background, then you're going to have to think about what you want to do. I would recommend going the C# route, but there is a little bit of a learning curve either way. The other thing is that in .NET, much like in Access, the amount of actual language-specific work that you do is relatively small. Primarily, what you're doing is talking to the application objects that are exposed. So in Access, you're talking to a forms collection, for example, and then you're talking to controls on that form. So whether you do that in VB or whether you do that in C#, the vast majority of figuring out how to do what you want to do is working with the application API. In other words, with how Access exposes its functionality. And it's the same thing in .NET. What you're really doing is figuring out, how do I talk to the .NET class libraries to do what I need to do. So the language is important because the syntax is different in C#. You've got curly braces and semicolons. In VB, you have line breaks, and you have end function and different syntax, end select, and so forth and so on. But again, most of the work that you're doing, just like in Access, is figuring out what system API am I going to call. So we're going to do C#, and we're going to go web. So again, what did I do? I'm going to go ahead and cancel out here just to recover from that long digression. New project, C#, web, and there we are. And I'm going to do ASP.NET web application. The core is the new stuff that's just been released. It's a different. They're going with a platform independent model, so that they have ASP.NET Core, in fact .NET Core, that runs on Linux and Mac. And then the classic .NET runs only on Windows. And we're just going to go with the classic model. And most of the examples are still in the classic. And unless you're planning on hosting your website on Linux or Mac, it's fine. So new project, C# web, ASP.NET web application. We'll call this NWO customers. Doesn't really matter what name I put. That's the solution name, and we're going to click OK. And now it gives me templates, and I'm going to pick MVC. And I have the option to include a user authentication, which is actually really great. If your database is authenticated, in other words, you have a table of users that you allow to access your database, ASP.NET out of the box gives you authentication, username and password. It's fantastic. If we have a chance, we'll talk about it more. I'll leave it on. You also have the option to use none, so you can just have it open. You can use Office 365 or Azure Active Directory, or you can use Windows Authentication if you're running it on a local intranet. So this is actually really cool. We're not going to talk about it, but you can actually use Azure Active Directory or Office 365 by clicking this radio button. You can have your database application authenticated against your Office 365 or your client's Office 365 accounts. It's magnificent. We're just going to keep individual for now. So we checked MVC. I want to click Go. MVC is Microsoft's sort of leading database-driven web application platform. Stands for Model View Controller, and it basically splits up, if you will, three tiers of the application into different folders. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this, but basically we have models, we have views, and we have controllers. Models map your data class. Controllers route requests coming into the browser into where they need to go, and views are basically your forms, except they're going to be web-based rather than access-based. So we expand these: models, controllers, and views. You can see that in controllers, I have account controller, home controller, manage controller. Account and manage are associated with that user authentication that we selected. Had we said no authentication, we would only have a home controller. Models are the data classes, so they basically take database table fields and map them to classes and properties. And again, we have all these are associated with the user authentication. And then we have views down here, and we have account, home, manage, and shared. So again, account maps to the account controller, manage in the view maps to manage controller, and home manages to a home controller. I have, in about 5 minutes when we're done with this demo, I have a pointer to a page that you can read in a little bit more detail about this. I don't want to cover all the details right here. Okay, so to run this application, by using that template that we picked when we created this, we have a default application. So I'm going to hit Control F5, or I could hit Debug, Start Without Debugging. And what's going to happen is that Visual Studio is going to compile and generate this site, start up the web server. Remember I said that there was a web server that runs when you run your application in Visual Studio. And if you see down here at the bottom right, I have this thing in my system tray, IIS Express. So that's what's running. And you can see here, this is actually a template that is generated for me out of the box. So I have a home page, I have an about page, I have a contact page, and then I have the ability to register and log in. So here's that user management. So I'm going to go ahead and register over here, and I'm just going to put in gcyoung@dawsonbutte.net, and I'll give it a password. Any password, it doesn't matter. This is just hitting the local authentication system. I think I probably missed a character there. Go ahead and register. So now we are a user in this application, and the developer or the site administrator can control which users have access to different parts of the site, and in fact they can control level, what are called roles. So you can assign a role to say an admin and a user or a read-only user. And then that person, let's say if you say that a certain user is a read-only user, then they can only read the data, they can't edit it. All right, so we have this basic website that we've created out of the box just automatically for us by Visual Studio. So now, how do we take our database and get it into this application? And this is one of the just fantastic things that the Visual Studio and the .NET framework do. What we're going to do now is that we're going to tell Visual Studio to go look at our SQL database running locally. And the Visual Studio is going to inspect that database, and he's going to create classes from our tables that our application will then automatically talk to in order to have that read-write functionality in the website. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to controllers, we're going to go right-click, add, new scaffolded item. No, sorry, we're going to add the data model first. So there are two parts. First we have to add the data model, then we add the scaffolded item. So let's do that data model, and this is just really, really cool. So I'm going to go here and click go there. I'm going to get a model. I'll just call it NWO model. And now we get a data model wizard, and it's going to ask us about this model. So in Visual Studio, you can do, there are two ways of creating your data context in your application. One is what we're going to do. We're going to go talk to an existing database and basically reverse engineer our classes from that. That's called designer from database. The other thing that we can do is code first, where we actually start with code, and the code turns around and generates a SQL database for us, which is pretty cool. We're going to work with an existing Access database, so we're going to go ahead and generate this automatically from that database. So we're going to say, yeah, okay, I want my model to come from a database. Remember, a model is just classes that map to database tables. So we'll go next. So now what we need to do is to hook up to that database. So I'm going to assume that we don't have that. I'm just going to click New Connection. So my server name is just dot, it's local. What's my database? NWO customers. And I'm using Windows Authentication. So let's test the connection. Okay, test connection succeed. And go ahead and go OK. So what did I do? I said, go to this database, this local connection. Here's the connection string that's automatically generated for me. And we'll call this NWO entities. Go next. And it's retrieving information from that database. There are no views, there are no stored procedures. And we just have our table customers, which we'll use. And our model, we'll just call it NWO model. We can give it any name we want. And we'll go finish. So now Visual Studio is inspecting that SQL database, and it's going to come back and generate a schema diagram for us, and it's going to generate classes to talk to that database. Again, we haven't written any code yet. So there's our table. Just pinned or unpinned. There we go. There's our table. So this is the EDMX, or the data model diagram that is generated for us from that Access table. So if we go back here into Access and we look at our table and we'll go into Design View, see we got ID, company, last name, first name, job title, yada yada yada, and Visual Studio generated a mapping of that table for us here automatically. It added this SSMA timestamp. That's a field that the migration assistant puts in. Now this is one thing that's interesting. We can go ahead and change this. We can work in this model and delete things or add things. They won't get mapped to the database, but we can do local stuff. And I'm going to delete SSMA timestamp because we don't need that. So we have that. I'm going to go ahead and save. Oop, I hit something else there. I'll go ahead and click File, Save All. Okay. And then I'm going to build this by going build solution. And now,
George,
yes.
I can't see your screen anymore.
Uh-oh. Oh, you're right. Let me know when it's better.
It says it's loading, so I assume it's going to be better in just a second. That's it. Thank you so much.
I apologize. I mishit a keyboard shortcut that apparently nuked that window. I apologize.
Yep, no problem. Go ahead. I don't think we really missed anything. It was pretty quick there. So.
Okay. So as I was saying, we have now a model, an entity model, a data diagram, a data schema that maps directly to our access schema. And it also, of course, maps to the SQL schema. So what I did is I just saved it and built it. And now if we come down here and we look at customer.cs, and this is the core part of how this model view controller stuff works, is that you can see a class called customer was generated, and it has a string or an int type that maps to each of those tables, or sorry, each of those fields in that customer table, and you can see it has what in C# are called getters and setters. Basically how you would both read and write to that field. So what Visual Studio did for us is that we said, make me a model, and Visual Studio went off, we pointed him to the database, and he generated this class from that database. Again, we only have one table, but you can use related tables, and it works just the same way, and it creates the relationships for you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to scaffold this out. And we're going to go add scaffolded item. Now we're going to say MVC controller with views, and we're going to tell it what class we want to talk to. Well, it's the customer. And the data context class, that's the Northwest Orders entities that we created. And that's it. So what it's going to do is it's going to create a customers controller. Notice that we don't have one over here. We have account, home, and manage. We don't have customers. It's going to create that for us, and it's going to create all the views for us. So let's go ahead and click Add. And you'll see a Customers controller will appear here on the right, and the Customers View folder will appear over there in the Views section. Okay, done. So there's our Customers controller. And if we go down to our View for Customers, we should have something that's going to look a little bit familiar to us in our database lingo. We have a Create view, we have a delete view, we have an edit view, and we have a read view, a details view. So this is CRUD, right? Create, read, delete, and update. Let me go ahead and build this again by going build solution. And now let me go back to my web page, which should still be up. There it is. And I'm just going to hit refresh. And now it created, you'll remember it created something called Customers Controller. So all I do is I type in customers, assuming I can spell. And you can see I have basically a tabular view of all the customers. Did I write any code? No, I didn't write any SQL. I didn't write any C#. I didn't write any HTML. This is all generated for me automatically. And you can see here we have all the information. Now let's do something here. So we got Thomas, just to make sure we're not having any smoke and mirrors here. Let me go ahead and go back to my view, and this is again my access client that's talking to my linked SQL table. And let's change him back to, let's, Tommaso. Okay. So I changed him in Access. Let's go over here and hit F5, and hopefully this guy will change to Tommaso. And there he is. So I've got my Access client talking to a SQL backend, and that same SQL backend has generated a database application for me. Notice here on the right, edit, details, and delete. So let's look at, let's do with Thomas again. So we'll go in here and we'll go edit. Now I can, Tomasino, okay? And click save. Tomasino, let's go back into Access, refresh this, Tomasino right here. Let's go over to our SQL Server Management Studio, Tomasino. Everything's talking to each other. So that's edit. I can also just view details from him. And I can also create a new one. So let's create Access Lunchtime. Last name Barnes. Sorry, Maria, you're on the spot here. So Guru Excellence. The business phone 800 123 457. Address 123 Access Lane. Okay, let's go ahead and click Create. And there we have Maria Barnes Access Lunchtime created. Let's go back into SQL Server, and we'll scroll down, and there we have Access Lunchtime Maria created. And just to show no smoke and mirrors, let's go into Access, and there it is, Access Lunchtime. Maria Barnes, if I go into my form, refresh this. There we go. So that's all working, and again, I can, sorry Maria, I'm going to go ahead and delete you. Are you sure you want to delete this? Delete. And she's gone. And if we go back over here, she's gone. And if we go back over to SQL Server, no more Access Lunchtime. So that was basically, that's basically it. To summarize, what we did is that we took an Access to ACDB, we migrated the table into SQL Server, and then we repointed our Access application, our Access client, the Forms application from that using the ACDB to that SQL Server database, and then we popped over to Visual Studio and generated, without writing a single line of code, a full-blown create, read, update, and delete model. That's a full website. One of the really cool things about this template that's used in MVC. Oh, by the way, we're not going to expect our users to type in customers. So this is where you need to have a little bit of HTML, and this is where if you have some HTML background, you're gonna smoke through this easily. If you don't, you'll want to spend a little time on Pluralsight or reading around on the internet. But there's a page called Layout here, which contains essentially the frame. So I'm just going to go in here real quickly and add. Index, sorry. Okay, and now let's go back over here to the site, and we're going to refresh it. And there are customers. So now we just added that to our UI, and we click customers, and there we are. And so there's a little, once you want to start doing a little bit of customization, then obviously you have to know a little bit of HTML. But getting to the point where you can get up and running with a read-write, full-blown web app in ASP.NET, and I think we did it in about, total of maybe 20 minutes from start to finish. The last thing I want to mention is one of the things that's really cool is that this this supports mobile views out of the box. So here I am in the full web view, right, looking at a browser. But if I'm in a mobile browser, right, I think watch what happens here. I don't know if you saw that, but notice that the text box drops below the label. And if I keep going, watch what happens up here in the menu bar at the top. Boom, it turns into a little hamburger, and now I have customers down here on a drop down, and I have my login. So now I'm back at customers. I do need to do a little bit of work on the table to, maybe remove some fields or something to make it fit better. But wherever I have a form view, it works out of the box. Again, I haven't done anything to spruce it up to make it look a little better. I want to close by showing you our website, dog.org. And this is generated essentially the same way. What I did is I took an existing Access database, I migrated up to SQL Server. In fact, they were individual databases for presentations, consultants, library, and sponsors. So I took those individual Access databases, took the tables and copied everything over into a single Access database, set up the relationships and the indices, and then did exactly what we did here and migrated it up to SQL Server and then generated the site. And you can see here that I've done a little bit of work on the look and feel. If we go to presentations, you can see that we've got the different presentations there. But watch what happens again here when I resize this down. There's our mobile view. So if you go to dog.org under smartphone, you're going to have this view, where you get the consultants there and the sponsors, and everything just renders really, really nice on a mobile phone. But if you're on a full tablet or a browser, you get the full view. So dog.org, if you want to have a look at sort of what an actual up and running real life website that was built using exactly what we did here does. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. That's my presentation. Looks like we have a little bit of time for questions, so I will stop talking.
Okay, I'm going to unmute everybody, so if you maybe. George, are you still there? Nope, I muted you.
I'm here.
All right, sorry, I muted you accidentally.
That's okay.
So I'm trying to unmute everyone else, but I'm not having very good luck. Here we go. In case anyone has questions, feel free to ask. That was a wonderful. Whoever's on the phone, I can't unmute for some reason. Maybe they've got themselves muted. So hopefully they can unmute themselves. But once again, if you joined us late, this was George Young, who is the Vice President of the Denver Area Access Users Group, which meets, I believe, the first Tuesday of each month at 6:30
Yes.
Mountain Time?
Yes.
Does anyone have any questions for George? I do have one question, and we do only have a few minutes. We got 3 minutes left here. What are the advantages of doing it this way rather than having like an Access web app where you're using that instead?
Great question. In fact, the thing that prompted myself and a couple of colleagues, acquaintances of mine, was that we initially looked at Access web app and with 2013 and noticed that, oh, hey, it's using a SQL database backend. That's cool. And so then what we the wheels started churning, and we had a client who was using Access internally, but also had a need for a web presence, which I had initially developed in a separate SQL Server database. And then what we had to do was to figure out, okay, how do we avoid this data duplication if we've got all this data in Access and we've got this separate live registration data coming in SQL Server? How do we go about doing this? So when we built the Access web app initially, and then we saw the SQL backend, then we really started digging down into it. The advantages of this approach of basically, using ASP.NET as opposed to the Access web app, I think are manifold. Some of the main ones are the Access web app has to run in SharePoint, in a SharePoint tenant, either SharePoint Online via Office 365 or internally. So the amount of the people to whom you can expose your application is limited by being able to have them be able to log in that single tenant. So if you're working with company abc.org, then they need to have an Office 365 tenant, and anybody who needs to access your application has to be able to log into that tenant. You cannot expose that outside of that. A second big problem with the Access web app is that it's not at all mobile friendly. So even if you're in a situation where you have Office 365 tenants, if you try to look at it in a web browser on a phone, it's horrible. It's not usable. So you have no mobility at all. Another thing is that you're very, very constrained in the UI in terms of what you can do. And as you talk to people who have investigated web apps, they're great for doing something very, very simple that needs to be entirely internal within an organization where everybody has SharePoint, and you don't need to do any UI customization whatsoever. Because it doesn't support VBA. The UI layout language is very rudimentary. It only uses data and UI macros. So if you have stuff in VBA in your database, you have to turn those into macros. There are people who have spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of time trying to make the web app do what they wanted to do, and they could have done it in almost no time by using ASP.NET. The disadvantage of ASP.NET is that you do actually have to know some HTML. You do have to know a little bit of C#. Notice that we didn't even write a single line of C#. But if we're going to go back in and do a little customization, maybe change some queries, maybe add some search functionality, then we at least need to know the very basics of it. I have a client, a very, very large multinational computer hardware vendor. And the manager had originally generated an Access web app, and he was trying to do something. And I spent a couple hours with him, and it was something that you just couldn't do. So I said, hey, listen, let me quickly, give me a couple of hours, and I'm going to go off and whip off the same thing up in an ASP.NET website hosted in Azure. And he said, fine, go ahead and do it. And he was ecstatic that he was suddenly able to do the things that he was not able to do in the web app. And it's turned into a very, very good relationship that's gone down that route as opposed to the Access web app.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, George, and for this very interesting presentation. I know that I have learned a lot. With that, we will just say thank you for joining us today. And please feel free to check out AccessUserGroups.org. From there, you can get to the various different user groups. The Denver area user group is one of those listed, so you could follow their meetings, which are held the first Tuesday of each month, or some of our next meetings, which again are the last Tuesday of each month at the Central Time noon hour. Next month, we're going to go into VBA functions and how to use them. So hope you can join us next time. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Maria.